biggest lie of modern economics is to convince you that the value of money going up would be bad, and that the best way to fix it is to devalue your money, bring the value of money down. And the way to do that is to increase the supply of money. That's because modern economics is just propaganda for theft. It's just propaganda for theft through inflation. So everything you've learned at your university over the last century, I regret to inform you, has basically been inflationary propaganda. All of these Nobel Prize winning economists, the vast majority of textbooks that you've learned, all of the people that get wheeled out on propaganda rags like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and CNN and all that stuff, and Harvard University and all of these elite institutions, they are not some geniuses who managed to figure out great insights about economics. They're just actors who repeat the same stupid lines about we need more money printing to fix things. And then when that causes a catastrophe, then guess what? We need more money printing in order to fix it even more.
All right. Hello, friends. Thank you so much for coming by for another episode of the Ben Wehrman podcast. I appreciate you stopping by. We have an extremely special guest today. This gentleman has been responsible for so many of the hours of my life being lost down different rabbit holes, from Bitcoin to the carnivore diet, and more recently, the whole Israel-Palestine situation. And we'll get into all of these things. I don't know how we're even going to figure out what to talk about. There's too many things to, but Saifedean Ammous, it is a huge pleasure to have you here, sir. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Ben.
So, like I said, I have mentioned you and your books definitely more than any other person out there during the podcast so far. So it's difficult to know where to start, but I think we'll just do what we normally do, which is your backstory. And we love getting a good foundation for who we're talking to here. So we could start all the way back to you were born in Palestine and sort of tie the dots up to becoming a Bitcoin author. I think that's a really interesting journey. Anyone hears that, it's not your average life story. So give us a rundown.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I look back and thinking, just how did all of this happen? And the short answer is that it was a very, very long process. I've been on this earth for 44 years, so a lot has happened. So I don't know how much time do we have today, but I'll try and keep it brief. So yeah, as you said, I was born in Palestine, but when I was very young, we moved to Saudi Arabia, and I lived there until I was about 6 or so. Then we moved to Brazil, natural progression from Saudi Arabia, you go to Rio de Janeiro. So I spent 2 years there. My dad is a surgeon, and there he went to train in plastic surgery under what was then the world's pioneer and world leader in plastic surgery. His name was Pitangui, a Brazilian surgeon. So then after that, we went back to Palestine. We lived in Palestine until I finished high school. And then I went to university. I was at an American Quaker school in Palestine, probably, I think, the oldest missionary school in the Middle East. It's called the Friends School. So I've always had a soft spot for Quakers because of that. And then I went to the American University of Beirut, also a missionary school, a missionary university where I studied engineering. And then I did a master's in the London School of Economics in development. And then I did my PhD at Columbia University in sustainable development. And after completing that, I moved to Lebanon, back to Lebanon, where I was a university professor for 9.5 years at the Lebanese American University. During which time, during my Columbia years, as I was doing my PhD, it was, standard mainstream stuff. And I struggled to make any sense of it. But then toward the end, around 2007, 2008, as I was struggling to make sense of what I was going through, I came across, I think the entry of the rabbit hole may have been Karl Popper. I read Karl Popper. That led me to Hayek. I started reading Hayek. Hayek blew my mind. And then that led me to Mises and Rothbard. And that just completely radicalized me.
What year was this, just for a timeline?
2007 to 2009, really. That was my last 2 years during my PhD. And it was happening during the time of the financial crisis, which gave it extra impetus because, you get online or get on TV and all of these Keynesian economists are in unison saying, Yep, we have no choice but to print trillions of dollars and hand them to these bankers, because otherwise you won't be able to have bread on the shelves next week. So we have no choice but to give all of these bankers trillions of dollars and thank us for it. And everybody, all of these economists are just nodding. The Bernanke or John Paulson would go on TV and say, "Yep, we need 3,000 quadrillion dollars for a bunch of Wall Street banks." And then all the economists would be like, "Yeah, well, you see, they're right. Without the 3,000 quadrillion dollars for Wall Street banks, we would all be in bread lines that have no bread, and everything would fall apart. All the farms would stop working. All the food would stop working. Like all of those farmers and people who eat their food, they have no way of ever communicating or getting their goods across unless Goldman Sachs bankers make trillions of dollars every day." So that was, that was a huge wake-up call, but also came at the time when I was beginning to read the Austrians, and then I found Mises.org sometime, I think in 2008 or so. Yeah, 2008. And, it made it more difficult for me to finish my PhD, because at that time, I was thinking of this in terms of, oh, wow, wait until my committee reads all about this. They're going to be so excited, because this is really interesting stuff that is going to help us figure out how to stay away from all of these methodologically suspect economic ideas. And, that turned out to be very naive and innocent, because modern universities, people don't really have, how do I put this? There isn't really much in terms of intellectual work going on. It's just basically write whatever you need to write in order to get into, in order to get published, in order to get a job. And nobody is interested in having actual real debates on intellectual questions. So it created a whole bunch of problems for me, delayed my graduation. I had to rewrite a lot of my thesis. But then eventually I did get the PhD. And then I moved to Lebanon, where I was teaching economics. And at that point, I became pretty radicalized as a gold bug. And I thought I was going to be in Lebanon maybe for a year or two while I figure out what I want to do, because probably academia is not for me. And the initial plan of what I wanted to do, this was what I was focusing most of my time on in 2010, 11, and 12, was to basically build a gold-based Bitcoin. In retrospect, I kind of came to the conclusion that the way to fix this mess is for people to have gold, and the way to have gold is to build an app where people are able to move gold around. And the way to do that would be to have the gold stored in cold storage, effectively in Switzerland. And then, when people send us money, we buy gold, and then they have the gold in Switzerland, and then we can move it around between network members where the gold doesn't move. But on your app, you see that your gold is moved. So it's kind of like Bitcoin, but instead of having magical imaginary coins in the sky, you have real physical gold bars in a Swiss vault. But sadly, spent a lot of time and money on this in 2011, 12, and 13. When I knew about Bitcoin, I'd heard vaguely about Bitcoin, and I was ashamed to say it, but I was very, very Peter Schiff at that time. I was basically every single stupid argument you've heard Peter Schiff make today, I used to make at that time. And I used to think, well, the Bitcoin thing is interesting, it's nice, but clearly it's not going to work. And I had this exact really, really dangerous thing that I've seen so many people when it comes to Bitcoin, which is it's maybe the most expensive mistake of my life, which is, yeah, I know why Bitcoin won't work, so therefore I'm not going to be wasting my time getting into learning about the details of it. And that, that was the phase from Bitcoin under $1 to Bitcoin over 1,000, basically, where I was just sitting there and thinking, yeah, well, it's not going to work. So eventually, around 2013, is when I started to realize I'm an idiot, and maybe I should be paying attention to this stuff. In particular, it was in 2013 Two things, I think. Well, three things. First of all, the price kept going up. And so I remember in 2011 thinking to myself, this is a cool idea. And I remember reading an article, I think it was a Wired magazine that wrote an article about Bitcoin when it hit $1. Or maybe Slashdot. No, I think Slashdot was earlier. But anyways, I remember reading an article saying one Bitcoin hit $1. And I remember saying in 2011, I was going to New York for a summer job. And I thought to myself, yeah, I'm going to buy 100 Bitcoin for $100. And then I went to New York, obviously spent hundreds of dollars on all kinds of stupid nonsense that I don't even remember, and didn't buy the 100 Bitcoin because by the time I got to New York, it was like at $8 or something like that. So I thought, yeah, well, clearly it's too expensive now and it's going to crash. And then the government is going to ban it. And then they're going to throw everybody in Guantanamo Bay. So if this thing does survive, it'll happen after the government throws everybody involved in Guantanamo Bay. And then it survives, and then maybe I'll buy when it's back under a penny. So very typical behavior, very typical. You just see it today. My friends call me, yeah, okay, fine, maybe I'll buy, but now it's 100. I'll buy when it's back over, when it's back under 20,000, or I'll buy when it's back under 50,000. Typical no-coiner behavior, textbook. And the the sad reality is you end up buying after a couple of digits have been added to the price. So instead of buying when it goes under $1, I ended up buying with 2-3 digits added to the price. So then, so 2013, first the price keeps going up, and eventually you just start questioning your assumption, because in my mind, there's no way that it could have gone up to about $1,000 in 2013. And so clearly something is wrong about it. The other thing was there was, I read an article, I think it was Forbes magazine in 2013, talking about the massive hash rate on Bitcoin. And before then, of course, being an idiot, I had never considered actually looking into the detail, and I hadn't even heard about Bitcoin mining being this industry. I remember hearing about mining in the early days. I remember even trying to download the software and mine on my computer at some point, but it didn't work because at that point, mining had shifted to like GPUs, and I had a crappy old laptop that couldn't handle the software and fell apart. So then when in 2013, when I realized that, oh, wow, people are actually building mining facilities, they're actually buying machines and plugging them in order to make Bitcoin, which for me awakened something, which is, because before that in my mind was, obviously one day when this becomes valuable, they're going to find a way to make more of it. It's not gold. It's digital. The people behind it are going to get together and say, hey, let's make more Bitcoin. But then when I found out that actually people are putting in serious capital investment to building machines and setting up facilities and connecting them to electricity in order to make Bitcoin, that means this isn't cheap, easy money. That means there may be a way in which the 21 million thing actually might stick. And then the third thing was the Silk Road, because when the Silk Road happened, it was, in my mind, that was the scenario of how Bitcoin dies. Some criminal activity is associated to Bitcoin, and then everybody related to Bitcoin is going to be considered complicit in that. And then they're going to throw a bunch of people in Guantanamo Bay, and then everybody else is going to get rid of their coins, and the price is going to die. So this happened in early 2013 when Ross Ulbricht was arrested. And so in my mind, that was the moment when I thought, okay, now it's going to crash. Now it's going to die. And instead, it just kept going up. So around 2013 is when I started recovering from no-coiner derangement syndrome and started thinking more critically about it and started reading it. But still, unfortunately, 2013, 14, 15, I still hadn't really spent a lot of time trying to understand it and focus on it. I was, memes and Twitter and putting in some pocket change into it, thinking that, this is too risky, this is too crazy, who knows what's going to happen. But at least I got off zero. But unfortunately, I didn't make it very far away from zero during those years. And then I got married in 2014 and had to spend money on all kinds of things like, weddings and wedding rings and honeymoons. And then I had a child, and then I had to spend all kinds of things on children stuff. So then only after my daughter was born in 2016, and then I started thinking more seriously about needing to be more productive and do things more than just my day job at university. And that's when I started thinking more seriously about Bitcoin, started reading more and more and more about it and researching it. And in 2017, I decided to write a book about it. And then it was published in 2018.
What was there to read that you were digging into? Because there's so many resources, books, podcasts, everything out there now that people have just no more excuses to not study Bitcoin and learn about it. But I'm assuming it was quite a few just random sketchy forums online that you had to dig through it. Where were you researching it from?
Yeah, random sketchy forums online is one major one. Andreas Antonopoulos videos were pretty big at that point. And there was that book written by a bunch of computer scientists, I think at Yale. I forget the exact name of the book. Cryptocurrency Technology. That was I forget the name, but there was a book that was, I think, in 2014 or so, that explained the technical aspect in a way that was pretty useful, which helped me. But yeah, there weren't a lot of resources, which is why it was very easy to believe silly things, because it was just there was a lot of uninformed people online making very bold predictions about it, and it was difficult to tell apart the signal from the noise. But with time, more and more content started to come around. Oh yeah, and of course, well, I should mention perhaps the most important resource I came across at that time was the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, Pierre Rochard and Michael Goldstein, and it was truly mind blowing because very few people had thought about Bitcoin. Well, maybe not few. At the beginning, a lot of people had, among the small number of people who had been working in Bitcoin or had related to Bitcoin, that they'd thought about the idea of the fixed supply money and how significant that is, but nobody quite formulated what we today know as toxic Bitcoin maximalism in its purest, raw, free-based form, quite like Michael Goldstein and Pierre Rochard around that period. So 2012, 13, 14, they wrote a bunch of blog posts. Basically, everything you need to know about Bitcoin. It's just very brief. And, they had another guy who was working with them at that time, Daniel Kravitz. He termed the coin hyper-Bitcoinization, which was very powerful as an idea at that time, because it really drove the point home that this isn't just going to be a side project for nerds. This is going to be serious business. So that really helped me begin to formulate. I came across it, I think, in 2015 or so, or 14. I can't remember when exactly I came across it, around that time. And that really helped me start to see things from the perspective of Bitcoin as hard money and the impact that Bitcoin can have on the world. And I'd already most people, I would say, they come into Bitcoin thinking about it, say, from a computer science perspective in the early days, or more recently from a gains perspective. For me, I think I was one of the few people who had come at it from the Austrian perspective, where the most interesting thing for me from day one was the fact that this is a money supply, that it's fixed, that the supply doesn't grow. So I already knew how much of a big deal that would be before I ever heard about Bitcoin. I was a gold bug, and I had a lot of the ideas that you read about in the Bitcoin standard were already formulated in my mind before Bitcoin came about. So whereas I would say for most people, it's a question of, oh, wow, this is cool, this is interesting, blockchain technology, cryptography, all of these are really cool things, or maybe complicated things, but, they come at it from this perspective, and then they come across the idea that, wow, money that, first of all, inflation is a big problem, and not having inflation is the solution, and that's why Bitcoin is such a big deal. That usually comes later. For me, it was the other way around. It was, I understood that this would be a big deal, but being a deranged no-coiner, I hadn't spent the time trying to understand why it could actually work. So I thought, wow, wouldn't that be great if we had something like Bitcoin? But obviously it's not going to work. And obviously I'm too smart to waste my time trying to learn how it actually works, because I'm so smart that I know that it won't work. And now I'm going to work on this 19th century monetary technology and try and integrate it with an app, because I am smart. So But then by 2014 and 15, these kind of ideas began to take root. But also 2014, 15 was a brutal bear market, the most brutal bear market in Bitcoin history. If you think 2022 was bad, 2022 was really just 1 year of downward price action. So November 21 to about December 22, it was a decline from 69 to 15,000. But afterward, it flattened out and it kept going up. Well, back then, it was a decline from about 1,200 down to 150. So almost 90%. And it dragged on for about 2 years. So from November 2013 until around, I think, yeah, the bottom was probably around November 2015, if I'm not mistaken, but something in that range. So it was very brutal. 2014 and 15, I'm astonished at the fact that I stuck around because I think a lot of people sold, gave up. And sadly, for me, I didn't pay enough attention during that time, and I didn't stack a lot because all you could hear was Bitcoin's dead, Bitcoin died, Bitcoin's failed, Bitcoin is not going to work. And, we didn't have Bitcoin Twitter out there putting hair on our chest and telling us to tell the no coiners to have fun staying poor and keep hodling. So it was a pretty brutal time during which I didn't really pay enough attention during Bitcoin. I was trying to get my own job in order. But then things started to turn around in 2016 when Bitcoin started to go up, and I had a child, so I started to think more seriously about what I need to do with my life. And then in 2017, I started to work on the Bitcoin standard.
Amazing. One of the staples of this podcast is that we never get tired of asking the most simple questions because you never know who's listening. So I want to hear it straight from you. What is Bitcoin? Mm-hmm. How do you explain this to people?
Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer software that operates a payment network that runs with its own inflation-resistant currency and allows you to transfer money anywhere to anyone else on the network, anywhere in the world, without having to go through any trusted third party and without having to go through any political institutions. That, for me, is Bitcoin in a nutshell. And then I would go through a more detailed explanation of what we mean by a peer-to-peer network, what we mean by open source software. That's another one that I would add to it. I think it's important. So what do we mean by open source software? What do we mean by peer-to-peer network? And then I'd say, the fact that it's permissionless and doesn't have a trusted third party is why it is effectively the fastest form of money in the world that allows you to have final settlement of financial assets in the fastest period of time. And secondly, and the most important thing about Bitcoin is the fact that the currency supply is fixed, means that it won't increase in supply unpredictably, and that means that it kills inflation, and that makes it the hardest money ever. And then I get into describing why hard money is such a big deal and what the implications are.
Yeah, and I think that's a good opportunity to inject what the problem is that we're actually trying to solve here. Because I think that we look around the social media landscape and our friends and family at the gatherings and people talking about what the problem is. It's always some political fight, left versus right, or capitalism bad, rich people bad. At least that's all I hear from the Northwest where I'm from in Seattle. It's very left blue over there. I think you and I would agree, largely because I got this from reading your book, is that central banking is the real problem here. I know you really talk about central banking being the biggest problem on earth. So could you flesh that out a little bit? What is, like, most people, I think if you just talk to them on the street and ask them, hey, explain central banking, what is it? People won't even know where to start. So how do you start explaining the problem that Bitcoin fixes?
Yeah, I think most people have very little idea about what central banks are and what they do. They think they're just government institutions, like the DMVs, Department of Education, the police department, the fire department. It's just, public servants out there trying to do their best. And if you're going to have some kind of libertarian leanings, you may be a little, you may be a little bit skeptical of the efficiency of using the central bank for this. But never, well, not never, but I think for most people, it's never it's never too critical of what the central bank actually is and what it really does. But as far as I'm concerned, and I say this repeatedly, and I don't think it's hyperbolic at all, it really is the biggest problem in the world, and it is at the root of the vast majority of the world's problems. I think there is no such thing as an economic problem that isn't related to inflation. All of the things that people think of as economic problems are consequences of inflation. Unemployment is caused by inflation. Prices rising is caused by inflation. Because by inflation, I mean an increase in the money supply. That's the correct definition. So prices rise, jobs get destroyed, business cycles happen, financial crises happen, governments go bankrupt, currencies collapse. All of those things, you think of them as different things, and you grow up, if you're getting educated or miseducated under a Keynesian system, you treat those things as if they're natural disasters. It's like you are an emergency worker, and you're being taught about how to deal with earthquakes and typhoons and hurricanes and so on. So, one day you wake up and there's an earthquake. Why did it happen? Doesn't matter. Let's pull people out of the rubble. That's what you need to learn. And so this is the approach that people generally have to economic ideas. Oh no, unemployment went up. Oh no, there's a fiscal crisis. Oh no, the government is unable to pay off its debt. Oh no, the government is defaulted. These things just happen. And the really pernicious thing is that the way that we fix those things, because people aren't taught about the causes of those things, they don't see that they're all caused by inflation. And they think that, all right, well, oh no, that's bad. So clearly we need to have somebody in charge to fix it, just like the fire department. And the way that we have that person fix it is to just give them tons of money or have them print a ton of money, which of course is going to lay the groundwork for the next crisis and financial disaster. So putting all of this together really gives you, I think, a much better understanding of how the world works and why inflation is at the root of those problems. And I guess if I were to summarize it, as I explained in the Fiat standard, I'd say the big picture summary of what the problem is with central banking and inflation is central banking makes money and banking a monopoly. So you cannot compete with your government's central bank and its banks. You can't decide to open a bank tomorrow that runs on gold, for instance, because you won't get licensed by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve only licenses fraudulent banks that use fake fiat inflationary money. Because if it licenses one bank that isn't fraudulent, that just offers people normal banking services where you just hold people's money and don't create money out of thin air and don't devalue their money, it would drive all the other banks out of business. In fact, a few years ago, there was a bank that wanted to do nothing but it was called the narrow bank, which in economics, narrow banking refers to the idea of just basically running a safety deposit box for people. You take money from people, you put it in a box, you hire armed guards to make sure that nobody takes the money from those boxes. And then when people want to take that money out, you give it to them. And in this case, they were taking their reserves, putting them at the central bank, getting that was their business plan. They were going to put the reserves in the central bank and then pass on the central banking interest rate to their depositors and make a spread. That was it, which is a dream. If you could have something like this, just so much of the U.S. Capital markets would go to something like this, because vast majority of people don't want to gamble with their savings. And if you're able to get the Federal Reserve's interest rate without having to go through a lot of risks, I think it's attractive for a big chunk of people's portfolios. Not all of people's portfolios. You're still going to want to, say, have some stocks. You're still going to maybe want to do private equity. There will be parts of your portfolio that you won't do. But there will be parts of your portfolio where you would want to just have wealth preservation. So they didn't license that bank. And Caitlin Long has also been trying to get something similar.
I was going to mention her. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, and again, she's not having an easy time trying to get that. And the reason for this is not because those banks would be dangerous to the depositors. It's because they would be dangerous to all the other banks. Why would you put your money in these fraudulent institutions like J.P. Morgan or Citibank who are holding on to a tiny fraction of the money that you give them and who could collapse at any time, when you could just go to the Federal Reserve, which is a lot safer than going through those banks. So then if you did that, everybody would take out a lot of their wealth from other financial institutions and financial instruments and just put them in that kind of bank. So you can't be having that. So you have to have a monopoly that prevents people from using responsible money, so that everybody is forced to be using the inflationary money so that they can be robbed from inflation. So that's the kind of big picture understanding of what the monopoly is. And then the problems, I would say, as I was describing the Fiat standard, you can see there are two aspects to the problem. On the one hand, the first aspect of it is the fact that because the government and the central bank are able to devalue the currency, they're constantly robbing the people of wealth, which is terrible for people because it's making them poorer and poorer and taking away their wealth and compromising their ability to provide for the future, compromising their ability to save for the future. On the other hand, the second part of the problem is that wealth being constantly stolen from people and being given to the government gives the government an enormous amount of power and control over society, because it's constantly taking away your saved monetary energy and therefore constantly making you poorer and constantly making itself richer. So this is why in the 20th century, as I explained in the Fiat standard and the Bitcoin standard, we just have a long-term process of decline in savings, decline in financial security, decline in people's ability to think for the long term, increase in economic uncertainty on the one hand for individuals, and then on the other hand, an increase in state power. And you can't understand that without reference to the money printer. The money printer is just a constant tax on normal, productive people doing moral things, and a constant subsidy to people in government who are not doing, I would say, moral things, because they're relying on taxation, which in my opinion is immoral, and inflation, which is also immoral. So you're taxing the productive to finance the unproductive, but it's done at a scale of decades across the entire planet. And that, for me, is at the root of the vast majority of the world's problems, because this makes war a lot more affordable. This makes all kinds of government programs a lot more affordable. This turns politics into, as Mencken used to call it, an auction on stolen goods, where if you and a bunch of people can get together and vote on stealing stuff, then you can steal it. And you can steal it very easily because the government has a lot of money, because it can print money. So it can finance, well, first of all, it can steal for you through inflation. And secondly, it can steal for you through inflation financing jackbooted thugs who go around and steal for you. And so all kinds of barbaric and uncivilized behavior become very sustainable and profitable in a modern society because of the money printer. And I don't think it would be workable otherwise without the money printer. So this is really why Bitcoin is so important, because it brings you the possibility of being able to save in something that can't be devalued. And so therefore you get to keep your wealth. And the people who rely on stealing your wealth don't get to keep it instead.
Yeah, and circling back to the timeline we laid out of the teen years, 2013 or so, that was when I was freshly going into my Fiat university right there, 2013, 2014, to go straight to that Econ 101 class for those easy credits where they were teaching me exactly that. You got to have 2% inflation. It's good for you. It's amazing.
Safe and effective.
Safe and effective. Yeah, it's just, and it's so crazy how this is just so stapled into everyone's mind that it's normal to have this random inflation number. Most people don't even think of it, but the people that do think about it and read the economics magazines, they just hear this number and they say, okay, that works. And one of the preliminary things that people must believe in order to fall for that is that deflation is a very scary, bad thing. So could you explain maybe what deflation is? It's obviously the opposite of inflation by name. What is this idea of deflation, and how could a deflationary currency like Bitcoin actually change people's lives?
Yeah, well, so the term deflation may not be entirely accurate in the case of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is inflationary in the sense that the supply is increasing and the supply never goes down. Deflation, I think the correct terminology for it is the correct terminological definition of deflation is a decline in the money supply. Now, the Keynesians call inflation an increase in prices and deflation a decrease in prices. I don't think that's accurate, but language is all about convention. So for me, the Keynesians have succeeded in destroying the usefulness of the I word. It's just better not to use the word inflation, which is why if you go through my books, you'll see that I don't use that term often, that I usually try and distinguish between an increase in the money supply and an increase in prices, because otherwise you're just stuck arguing about this terminology. So putting aside the term deflation, the key thing about Bitcoin is that the supply doesn't increase beyond what has been scheduled, and that there's a fixed supply. So the supply growth rate is constantly declining. Currently, we're already at 19.7, I think, million Bitcoin. So there's only 1.3 million Bitcoin to be mined over the next century or so. So the importance of this cannot be overstated. This is truly, for me, the most important technological development of the 21st century, and possibly many centuries to come even. I don't think people quite understand just how enormous it's going to be. And the reason for that is the current monetary system, the way it works, is built on the lie that you need to increase the money supply in order for the economy to function. It's such an elementary lie, and honestly, I think it's a great IQ test. There are people who get it immediately, and there are people who don't get it. And if you're one of the people who don't get it, I regret to inform you that the stuff between your ear isn't high grade. Let's just put it that way.
You may have fun staying poor, allegedly.
Yes, allegedly. And the key idea is this: the money itself is not a good. It's not an economic good that whose quantity matters to your satisfaction. Mises calls it a sui generis good. It's a good like no other, where the quantity of the good itself doesn't matter. What matters is the purchasing power of that good. And so therefore, you don't care if you're getting $5 or 50 yens or 5,000 euros. Its quantity itself doesn't matter to the satisfaction that you get from it. So you don't care if you're getting $5 or 50 Japanese yen or 500 euros. The number of units that you're getting doesn't really matter. What matters to you is the purchasing power. So if I told you would you rather have $5 or 50 yen, you're going to say $5, even though 50 is larger than 5. Why? Because it's not like apples, it's not like homes, it's not like Lamborghinis. It's not something where the more you have of a good, the better it is. It's about the purchasing power. And so $5 have more purchasing power than 50 yen, so you prefer the $5 over the 50 yen. So what matters in money is its purchasing power, is its ability to be exchanged for other goods, which does not require the quantity of it to be increased, because you can just increase the purchasing power of it. And this is such a powerful idea. And if you get it, you get money. And the most important implication of this is that any supply of money is enough as long as it's physically manageable. You can't run a global economy on one gold coin, because how do you break it down so that 8 billion people can have it? But you could if you have financial assets backed by that one coin. The one coin would be worth $50 trillion if that was the only gold coin we had, and then there would be financial instruments backed by it. But ultimately, you don't need to increase the supply of money. This is the key point. You don't need to increase the supply of money as the economy grows. And if you get this, congratulations to your mother for bringing you to this world. If you don't get this, my condolences to your mother for bringing you into this world. If you think the world needs to make more money because we want to trade more, you are not going to make it. It's exactly as idiotic as saying we need to expand the inch in order for me to get taller. No, we don't. The inch is the thing that we use to measure your height. And as you get taller, you just are measured with more inches. So it's very similar with money. If you had a fixed supply of money, what would happen over time is that the value of the money would go up. So The biggest lie of modern economics is to convince you that the value of money going up would be bad and that the best way to fix it is to devalue your money, bring the value of money down. And the way to do that is to increase the supply of money. That's because modern economics is just propaganda for theft. It's just propaganda for theft through inflation. So everything you've learned at your university over the last century, I regret to inform you, has basically been inflationary propaganda. All of these Nobel Prize winning economists, the vast majority of textbooks that you've learned, all of the people that get wheeled out on propaganda rags like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and CNN and all that stuff, and Harvard University and all of these elite institutions, they are not some geniuses who managed to figure out great insights about economics. They're just actors who repeat the same stupid lines about we need more money printing to fix things. And then when that causes a catastrophe, then guess what? We need more money printing in order to fix it even more. So this is what it ultimately comes down to. The fiat economists and fiat economics in general is one giant gaslighting operation to convince you that we need to increase the supply of money, and if we don't do it, everything would be bad. And the main and dumbest argument they have is, well, if the prices of things go up, then people are not going to be consuming. Why would you want to consume today if you can expect that your money is going to rise in value? And so you won't spend your money today because you expect that you can get more from it next year. And then because you don't spend your money, that puts people out of work. So your local restaurants and nightclubs, they'd all go out of business if people stopped spending because they expect that their money would buy them more next year. And then that puts people out of work. And then those people have no work. And so then they can't spend. And then that puts other businesses out of work. And then the people in those businesses can no longer spend. And then that goes round and round and then affects everybody. And now your own business gets affected because people aren't spending. And that should teach you for being so selfish as to save for the future instead of just spending everything that you have today like a monkey. And that's essentially what Keynesian economics comes down to. We need you to always be spending. We need you to always be losing purchasing power to incentivize you to spend. Because if you don't spend, then the economy falls apart. And there are no words in the English language to describe how utterly moronic this is. The basic idea is people don't consume because their money is losing value. People consume because they need to consume, because they want to consume, because life is finite. One day you're going to die and you want to get to experience those things. And so if you're hungry today and you really want to eat and you have the money that can buy you the food, you're not going to be, there are no humans that are as stupid as the Keynesians pretend to be in their textbooks, who are going to think, nope, I'm going to not eat today because if I wait another year, I'll be able to get a cheaper meal. So why would I eat today when I could just wait for a year and then my steak will be 3% cheaper next year? And so then you don't eat, and then the steak guy goes out of business. This is exactly how they think, which is completely idiotic. In reality, if you don't eat today or for the whole week, you're going to starve and die. And so you're going to eat, you're going to spend. Your choice is not between a steak today and a steak next year that is 3% cheaper. You're not going to make it to next year and to be able to get the 3% cheaper steak if you don't eat today. You're going to die. You're going to starve from now until next year. So your choice is buy the steak today or starve. That's the real choice. And nobody is as stupid as the Keynesians in order to be able to think, nope, I'd rather starve so that I can spend more, so that I can spend less next year. It's just completely insane. People are nowhere near as idiotic as the Keynesians pretend they are. So you also want to buy a house, and you don't care if it's going to get cheaper 10 years from now. You need the house now. You don't want to be homeless for 10 years so that you could then eventually get to save 20% on your house. You're going to buy the house. You need clothes. So what do we see now? What has changed? But you're still going to be spending money on the essentials that you need. But I think there is some kernel of truth in their idiotic idea, which is that you're less likely to spend stupid money on stupid things that you don't need. Yeah, so you will buy housing, shelter, you will buy the essential things that matter to you. But are you going to be buying another piece of plastic junk that you don't need, that's going to fall apart very quickly, when you can expect that the money would appreciate over the next year or so, then allowing you to buy a much better piece of plastic junk that you don't really need? Yeah, in fact, you'll see that a lot of the conspicuous, unnecessary consumption that people engage in would go down if you replace the money with a harder money. Because a lot of that consumption is motivated by the idea that, what am I going to do with this money? If I keep the money, it's going to lose its value. So, in a world in which money is losing value, it makes sense to buy the cheap plastic junk that you don't need today, because if you wait one more year, you won't even be able to afford it. It's going to become more expensive. So better get it now. Better buy things as early as possible. Better hoard stuff. Better accumulate more and more things rather than accumulate money, because money loses value more. So buy all kinds of cheap plastic crap. And that's a successful strategy in a fiat world. In a hard money world, it's a lot more similar to what the world was like in the 19th century. Less frivolous spending, less conspicuous consumption focused on essential and necessary things, and more savings. And that's where we really get to piss off the Keynesians. People would be able to save if the money was hard. And of course, this is a nightmare. If you're a kind of parasite who lives off of robbing people's wealth, then them being able to save in a form of money that it resists inflation makes things very, very hard for you. It's very difficult. So that's why there's an enormous amount of stupid propaganda against savings, trying to present savings as if they are this sociopathic act, as Keynes described it. You know, when you
They're
save,
so selfish, and they're not investing in the stock market. How dare they?
yeah, you should be out there buying stupid crap that you don't need in order to put people into work, and so that they'd have jobs producing stupid crap that nobody needs, and investing in companies that you don't understand so that they would have money to invest in all kinds of things. That's much better than saving, according to the Keynesians, because when you save, the money is just sitting there and doing nothing. And that's also very, very dumb. Money sitting there doing nothing is exactly what money is supposed to do. Money, when it sits there doing nothing, it's holding a value and transferring it across time. That's an enormously valuable good. In fact, that is the world's most valuable good as measured by total addressable market. There's arguably about $300 trillion of money in the world where people are just holding something whose sole purpose is to hold value into the future. That's much larger than any other market of any good. Nothing even comes close. So all of the NASDAQ is about $50 trillion. All of the S&P 500 is about $50 trillion. So all of the products produced by all of these 600 companies in NASDAQ and S&P are about $100 trillion in capitalization in terms of market demand. And yet the demand for just money, as I define it today, money is physical cash, checking accounts, saving accounts, and government bonds and gold. The demand for that is about $200 to $300 trillion. So the notion that money just sitting there is this useless thing is ridiculous. Why do people want $300 trillion of something that is useless? It's the Keynesians that are useless. It's not money sitting there that's useless. So money sitting there is extremely valuable. It gives you optionality. It allows you to transfer wealth into the future. It gives you liquidity so that you can get in and out of your position quickly. And you can benefit from opportunities that you could take advantage of. So clearly there's an enormous demand for money. And clearly being able to move money into the future, move economic value into the future is extremely valuable for you if you have a time horizon for making decisions that is longer than a goldfish's. You want to have something that can allow you to transfer money into your future if you care about your future. And I guess one of the key points that I communicate in my book, and perhaps maybe my original contribution to Austrian economics, is to explicitly tie people's time preference or people's valuation of the future as opposed to the present, people's future orientation, as a function of the hardness of money. I think this is a very compelling thing, that as the easier the money is, the less good the money is at holding on to its value, the more the money loses value over time, the less people are going to be thinking about the long-term future, and the more their thinking processes are going to fixate around the present. On the other hand, the harder the money is, the better the money is holding on at value into the future, the more reliable it can provide for your future self, the more it drives you to think about your future self. If you've lived in a world in which for the last 100 years, for as long as anybody in your family remembers, you've always had a form of money that is always holding on to its value well or appreciating slightly, you are a lot more likely to think about your life in 10 years from now, because you know how to save for 10 years from now. Your parents have done it. They taught you how to do it. Your grandparents and their parents did it as well. And if you save for the future, you put money aside for the future, then the future comes around and you're better off. So constantly you're improving your life because you're saving, and the value of the savings is going up, and that's making you better off. And so you're constantly lowering your time preference. In other words, increasing your valuation of the future, increasing your focus on the future, becoming more of a future-oriented person. And this is not just important in an economic sense. It is very important in an economic sense, because the more of a future-oriented person you are, the more you save, and the more that you behave in a way that is future-oriented in your economic activity. But it's even very important beyond your economic activity, because your orientation toward the future and the present, how much you discount the future compared to the present, is, I would argue, the most important metric in your life, the thing that is going to determine your outcomes in life, more important than pretty much anything else. Time preference is really, I think, one of the most important concepts in economics. When I used to teach Keynesian economics at university level, there was the usual garbage in the textbook that I would go over. But every class, every semester, I'd make sure there's at least half a lecture dedicated to talking about time preference. I'd always tell the kids, look, your stupid textbook doesn't talk about this, but this is the most important thing you're going to get from economics. So for the next half an hour or hour or whatever, we're going to be talking about this. It's not going to be on the exam. It doesn't matter, but it's going to be the most important thing you can learn from me. After buy Bitcoin, of course, which some of them did do, and they benefited enormously. But I'd sit them down and explain them the concept of time preference, and I'd tell them, this is what matters. I think that there's an enormous amount of data about how future orientation is a huge predictor of success. People who are able to think in the long term are much more likely to achieve what they want to do in the long term. And the opposite, of course, is true. And this makes a lot of sense. I mean, I just urge you to think about it yourself in your own life. It's very easy to demonstrate this to yourself without having to perform sophisticated academic experiments. Just stop thinking about the future for 5 years and then see where you end up in 5 years. You spend all your savings today. Behave in a high time preference manner with all of your relationships. So instead of behaving in a way that maximizes your long-term friendship with people, instead of behaving in a way that maximizes their happiness and yours in the long term, try and maximize the benefits you get from the friendship now. How's that going to make you behave? If you discount your friendship with a guy from 5 years from now, you're much more likely to cheat them. You're much more likely to steal from them. You're much more likely to assault them, abuse them, do all kinds of horrible things toward them. And that's just how it really is. When the money is losing value, all kinds of horrible behavior is incentivized because people don't care about consequences. And that's why society falls apart under hyperinflation. It's not just that people lose their wealth. Even more pressing than that, people can lose wealth. It's catastrophic, but you can recover from that. It's like if you got robbed and you lost your money. I mean, it's disastrous, but you can continue with your life and you can rebuild. But if your life isn't, but if the money is failing at holding value for the future, then you are in deep trouble, because now it's very difficult for you to be able to provide for the future. So then what do? You can't provide for the future. You can't think about the future. So why would you want to do long-term behavior that is conducive for the long term of your well-being? Why would you want to get into a family? How do you provide for a family in 10 years, 15 years when you don't have an easy way of providing for yourself in 10, 15 years? you become much more likely to commit crime because you discount the possibility of going to jail because that's a future thing. The present is, I want nice stuff now, and so I'm going to go and commit a crime to get the nice stuff. And yes, there's a chance that I get caught, but that's in the future. And that's really what high time preference behavior is. And really, human civilization is the process of our time preference declining. As our time preference declines, we become more civilized, become more moral. We think about the long-term consequences of things. We save more, we accumulate more capital. It increases our productivity, improves our standard of living, and allows us to save even more and accumulate more capital, lowering our time preference further, allowing us to think more and more about the future, lowering interest rates. When we save a lot, that makes more capital abundant. It brings the price down and incentivizes more and more long-term investment. It is saving that leads to investment. And it's absolutely criminal how the Keynesians have convinced the world that saving competes with investment. You have to first save. Every single cent that has ever been invested has to have first been saved. And by saved, I mean not consumed. First, you have to not buy the consumption good and save the money, and then you have to deploy the money in an investment. Even if that time period was 1 second from the time that you got the money until the time you deployed it in an investment, you saved it. First of all, you didn't consume it. So only through saving do we have investment. You have to first save. And so something that causes people to save more is going to cause them to invest more. The more we save, the more capital we have available, the more of that capital we can deploy into investment. That's how the process of civilization works. We delay the gratification, we delay the consumption, we refuse to consume the resources that we have, and therefore we have the resources to invest them, we have the resources to put them into productive use, and that then causes the increase in productivity, the increase in living standards, and the increase in incomes, and gets into a virtuous cycle where the more we invest, the more productive we are, the better off we are, the more we're able to think about the long term, and the more we are able to provide for ourselves in the long term, the better behaved we are, the more moral we are, the more cooperative we are, the more peaceful we are. We realize that the long-term benefits of cooperation and peace outweigh the short-term gains of conflict and aggression and theft and so on. So this is the process of civilization, and then inflation is the exact opposite. Inflation is the destruction of civilization because the exact opposite happens. You start realizing that your wealth that you're saving is not available, is not holding on to the value that you put into it. And so you become less likely to save. When you're less likely to save, you're consuming and you're engaged in high time preference, fast consumption. And that causes you to think more and more about the short term. And then that is reflected on all manner of behavior. And so you literally tear apart, well, not literally, but you tear apart the fabric of civilization. You tear apart the ability of people to have the incentive to behave in a way that is conducive toward long-term civilization. So why would I want to invest in maintaining a good relationship with my neighbors when I'm hungry today and I lost my savings and I feel robbed and they have nice stuff, and if I take it, then I'll be a lot happier. And who cares about what that's going to do to the rest of my life when I'm living next to people who know that I am a thief? So you get more of these conflicts, you get more of the immoral behavior, degenerate behavior, all kinds of behavior that doesn't lend itself to good long-term outcomes. And all of that becomes more and more of a problem. And so that, for me, is why, the subtitle of my second book, The Fiat Standard, is the debt slavery alternative to human civilization. Hard money, gold, had set us on a path of increasing productivity, increasing standard of living, lower time preference, lower interest rates, increased future provision, and more civilization for thousands of years, interrupted by periods of inflation destroying this. And the last century has been one horrible, horrible interlude of inflation that has been undermining the very, very foundation of human civilization, in my opinion.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to point out too is you talk about that neighbors analogy, which I think is so good, where the arithmetic of doing a bad thing and stealing from somebody changes when you're being stolen from every day through inflation, and you get put in a more desperate state. And this analogy of the increasing incentivization to do bad things in your society is very scalable. And it can go all the way up to the nation state level, where we have full scale war going on everywhere all the time. And I'd love to hear your take on this, because there was a clip from your book that I took that I shared around quite a bit, just explaining how you talked about the history of war and how in the past war would stop pretty quickly because one of the sides would run out of money. But now that we have infinite money printers everywhere, it changes this dynamic where we have infinity wars starting up and they just never end. So could you maybe give a little bit of color on that, why people need to understand this, how fiat money causes this crazy amount of war?
Yeah, this is a very, very, very important idea. And I discussed it in my book. It was pretty controversial when I first made it. And I think, a lot of basically propagandized NPCs. A great tell of a propagandized NPC is to laugh and lash out at a new idea before even considering it. And so a lot of idiots laughed at this. Ha ha, people think Bitcoin is going to end war. And yet the more of an idiot you are, the more you are likely to not believe this. But I think there is no question that there's something very, very true there. If you look at war before the fiat standard, yes, of course, war happens and people are people and human beings have all kinds of horrible things that they do to each other, and they've always done it. But if you look at what human civilization was achieving during the periods before fiat money, particularly if you look at Europe, European war was becoming more and more civilized. And the norms of war were being developed where civilians stayed out of war and wars were being fought between professional armies. So professional armies would get together and they would fight in a battlefield. And the reason for that was that it was extremely dangerous and expensive to attack civilians, and it was extremely dangerous for your political success, but more importantly, financially, because you needed the golden goose of the civilians working to pay you taxes so that you could fight a war, because you don't have a money printer. You can't just print money. And so the war by the 18th and 19th century, first of all, you look at the data from 15th to the 19th century, see that the intensity of war or the percentage of people that were dying in wars was going down. Fewer and fewer people were dying as a percentage of the world population because wars were becoming more and more civilized, because the kings who were spendthrift when it came to war generally didn't do well. If you were a king and you didn't care and you just went all out and you attacked all of your neighbors and you tried to conquer them, that wasn't going to really work out very well. It may have worked out at a time of very primitive human civilizations and tribes where wealth consisted of things that were very basic, land and cattle, and didn't involve heavy capital goods and an extensive capital production structure. But as the world's economic production becomes more sophisticated, as we use more capital, this becomes destructive. It's pointless to go and attack and pillage and destroy a town because you're going to be destroying their capital, and then that's a huge waste. You're better off fighting the military that controls that town in a battlefield, away from all the expensive capital, away from the homes, away from the civilians, and so then you gain political control of that place, and then you tax them. So that's a much more civilized way of doing the good old rape and pillage and murder thing that we as human beings have been doing forever. We have, as a civilization, begun to reduce the amount of unnecessary violence that we engage in, aggressive violence, I should say, and try and limit the damage that comes down, that happens from conflicts. And I think the key to that is the fact that the kings could not print money. I remember there was a quote I came across once. I think it was Frederick the Great, in Germany, may have been Frederick II, but I think it was Frederick the Great. And he said, somebody had sent him a note requesting all kinds of money for all kinds of things. And he said, basically, he said, I cannot meet your request because I cannot shit money. And that was it. And I remember seeing that quote, and I remember tweeting it at that point and saying, Fiat fixes this. That's what Fiat fixes. You had a king of a giant empire at that time, and he just understood that he can't shit money. He can't just satisfy all the demands of all the people he wants. He has to run a budget like everybody else. Money is gold. You can't shit gold. You can't just print it. You can't make it out of nowhere. And so you have to manage your money. And so the best way to manage your money is to be very prudent about it. Don't go around destroying people's capital. Don't destroy your capital in order to finance. Don't destroy your own people's capital in order to finance war. You want to be as peaceful as possible, and you want to maintain your wealth as much as you can so that you can use it effectively in a defensive manner. That's the key thing. If you live in a world in which you can't just print money out of thin air, you want to try and maintain your wealth as much as you can so that in case of a real actual attack of your neighbor coming and attacking you, trying to kill you, you have enough wealth to do it. And then your neighbor has an incentive to do that as well. So what does that do? It gives your government and their government the incentive to be peaceful, to find peaceful solutions, to avoid robbing each other. And that's very good for civilization. That allows both of your countries to thrive and prosper and accumulate more and more capital over time. But then Fiat fixes this. Fiat fixes the inability of kings and democratic leaders and presidents and parliaments, fixes their inability to shit money. It allows them to shit money. Quite truly, really, this is what happens. Now governments can just say yes to everything. You can just print money. Now war becomes very different because now under the gold standard, you fought a war for as long as you had physical gold. And then when you ran out of gold, that's it. You couldn't pay your soldiers. You were done. So that makes you a lot more conservative, and that makes you a lot less spendthrift. And that's necessarily going to be the case whether people consciously understand it or not. Kings and governments that are very aggressive are just going to blow away their capital and wealth and fight a lot of wars and eventually get destroyed. Whereas people who are able to understand the process of peaceful productivity, who are able to be civilized, who are able to arrive at peaceful resolution, they will accumulate capital. So under the gold standard, we had this economic evolutionary process that rewarded peaceful, civilized behavior, that rewarded more and more cooperation between people and punished aggression, punished war. And then with fiat money, we get the opposite, because with fiat money now, your government doesn't need to, it's no longer restrained by the quantity of gold it has. It's restrained by the value of all of the money held by all of the people using its currency. So it's very different. Back then, you had a big pot of gold in the government's treasury, and you had to manage that pot of gold not to run out. Now, the pot of gold is everybody's wealth because everybody's using your shitty currency, which is paper money or credit. And the supply of that currency is very easy to increase. So as long as people have purchasing power stored in your money, you can rob them by printing more of that money without having to go and take their wealth. Under the gold standard, if you wanted to go fight a war and you ran out of money, you had to send your troops to go put guns to people's heads and search them for their gold to try and collect their gold. That made you very politically unpopular. And basically it meant another war at home. People don't want to give their money because the king wants to conquer some faraway land so that he can rape and pillage and steal things. So no, screw you. I'm keeping my wealth. And now you've got to have a military confront your local population, which is just not very sustainable when your military is already being broke and trying to fight a foreign war. Well, with fiat, you don't have to send them jackbooted thugs to people's homes to take their money. You just print from the money and then you take them. So now the limit on your war effort has expanded significantly. Instead of the wealth held by the government, the limit in your war effort now is the wealth held by everybody using the government's money. And so that just allows them to run wild with war. And that's exactly why all of the belligerents in World War I suspended the gold standard in 1914. When they got into World War I, everybody suspended the gold standard and everybody got into printing money. And that's what allowed World War I to continue. Even though you look at the history of World War I, there isn't a single country that had anything substantial enough to gain from that war that would justify the efforts. Britain had absolutely nothing to gain. Well, I mean, not absolutely, but I mean, they wanted to destroy the Germans and limit German imperial ambition, which is ridiculous. They destroyed the British Empire in order to, get Namibia from the Germans or whatever. Sounds like a very, very, very stupid trade. And the Germans really didn't have anything to gain from the war. There was no reason for them to be fighting. The Russians probably, this is something I'm discussing in detail in my next book, The Gold Standard, which is going to be a lot of it is going to be about World War I. The Russians may have been the ones that had the actual objective from the war. They wanted to get Constantinople. They wanted to destroy the Ottoman Empire so that they would have Constantinople, because it would allow them to have access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, which would mean the ability to have a navy that was active all year round, because the Baltic froze in the winter, so they couldn't get their boats out of the Baltic in the winter. But if they could control the Black Sea and Constantinople and the entrance to the Mediterranean, then they have a warm water port, which was open all year round, and that would allow their empire to expand. And also they had a lot of they had a lot of religious importance to Constantinople, as Russia is the Orthodox Christian power, and Constantinople was the center of Orthodox Byzantine Christianity. And so Russia views itself as the continuation of that. And, in Russian, they call Constantinople, the word for it is Tsargrad. It's the city of the Tsar. So they'd always wanted to take it. So maybe the Russian government at that time was the only one that really had a concrete goal to get out of the war. But pretty much everybody else was just fighting because they could. And the people had no reason to be fighting. But then once the money printer was broken into, it never stopped. We just continued to have endless conflicts between governments printing more and more and more money. And that's why the 20th century was so deadly. As Ron Paul puts it, it's no coincidence that the century of total war was also the century of central banking.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the things that I've been learning as I have gone down the rabbit holes of these different wars over history, is that they truly are just banker wars, and these countries and armies are just puppets that they're using. And it's really wild the further you dig into it. And wars have become so fiat that there's so many situations now where you can't even call it a war, but more of just an infinite death ray machine is fueled by the money printer. And I think that's kind of a good transition. You probably know where I'm getting at here. One of the other topics you've been talking a lot about, and I have just more recently been digging into, is